Hello, welcome to the Nadia podcast. I'm Nadia Cater, your host, and today I'm joined again by Rebecca Sherry.
Hi, Nadia.
So for those of you who have not met Rebecca, Rebecca's my coworker at Propel. So we're both professional learning coordinators. And Rebecca also has an extensive experience as an ESL teacher with CNM. So we're doing a slightly different episode today. We're talking about, so it's kind of meta. We're a podcast episode about other podcasts. So Rebecca, you suggested this topic to me. Can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to talk about podcasts today?
Yeah, Nadia. So what I was thinking about when I suggested this idea is this is kind of in my mind, it's like a resource roundup. I don't know about everybody's personal situation, but my situation does involve a fair amount of trying to fit exercise into my day or running children around in the car. And I have found that podcasts are a really interesting way to get like a little bit more professional information in my day at a time when, it's not like normal work time kind of situation. And I know that a number of our teachers may have longer commutes for their various sites and things like that. So I thought that this might be interesting to people. You can listen to the podcast in the car. We do kind of want to mention to you that podcasts are a great resource for professional learning and for new ideas in your classroom. They do not meet the professional learning policy, so you cannot count your podcast hours for your professional learning hours for New Mexico at this time. However, you can get great ideas and things to do in your classroom or areas to pursue your professional interest and knowledge.
Yes, thank you for that disclaimer. We just want to make sure that we were clear on that. As professional learning coordinators, part of our job is to create professional learning and to keep track of everybody's. And yes, unfortunately, listening to a podcast does not count because you can't really demonstrate. We have a competency-based system, and you can't demonstrate competency by saying you've listened to something.
Yeah. But having said that, we still think this is a really valuable use of your time.
Yes, exactly. You lined up that so perfectly. It's getting ideas, hearing from other people. This is assuming that you do talk to your colleagues regularly about teaching ideas and stuff, because I know I've had teaching situations where I was the only teacher on a day and I worked part-time. I had other jobs. So like I never saw other teachers, right? So it was kind of like I was in a silo. So listening to other people's works and teaching and their ideas is just really helpful. And I think podcasts, as a host of a podcast, I do find it just a really interesting and simple way of engagement that can be done exactly what you said, is like between corralling kids around or listening, doing exercises, or even cooking, or anything that's going on in your life. I would say even data entry. You're doing data entry at work. You don't necessarily need to think about the stuff when it's entry. You don't need to pay attention, but you can listen to a podcast. Please do. So we really hope that you guys get something out of this, because we certainly have talking about it. So Rebecca, why don't you tell us what podcasts that we're going to talk about today?
So we have brought for you guys today 3 different podcasts that we wanted to highlight. And we want to start by letting you know that there are not a lot of adult education focused podcasts that we are aware of. Now, if you know more, please share that with us, because we would love to hear. But we don't know a whole lot of specifically adult education, HSE type focused podcasts. So what we're doing is we're talking about some of the other podcasts in the field of education that contain information that is really applicable to our classrooms and can easily be transferred to the situation that we work under. And so we can gain knowledge from like our K-12 colleagues in a way that is very relevant, not replicating their teaching practices, but gaining from their theory, for example. So the 3 podcasts we wanted to highlight are Cult of Pedagogy is the first one. And if you have played around in the field of education podcasts, like you will probably have come across this podcast before because it's super well known. And it is a K-12 based podcast where she really focuses a lot on teaching techniques and classroom techniques and different strategies to bring to instruction. But having said that it's K-12 focused like that. In listening to a number of episodes, I feel like you could get a lot out of this for adult education. And so if you're interested at all in this podcast, we'll highlight some of the episodes that we think might work the best for you in your setting. The second one we were going to talk about is T for Teaching. And T for Teaching is based in the community college setting. And this is a really interesting podcast where they bring in research from various professors that has an impact on the adult learning field, especially in community college. And so it's lots of recent studies. This is the one that engages your academic brain. So if you've been out of school for a little while, this is perfect for engaging your academic brain. And then the third one that we wanted to mention is a little bit different. And that one is called Bright Morning. And what Bright Morning is it's based around the idea of instructional coaching. Instructional coaching is really widely used in the K-12 system. It's coaching teachers to do better in the classroom, better with their job. And you have expert teachers coaching teachers at an earlier stage in their career, for example. We don't use it as much in adult education because it requires more full-time employees than we often have. But we're looking at ways that we can use this. And we have started with coaching in some of our professional learning offerings. So what I recommend out of the Bright Morning podcast, this one is excellent if you are a supervisor, because in this podcast, she is an experienced coach, and one of her strategies is that she does a coaching episode with an actual client, and then she does analysis of that episode with the client later. So during and later. So you can gain an understanding of the kind of tools that you can use in a coaching situation. So I love it for that aspect. She also speaks a lot on race and equity in the classroom. So if this is a topic that you are interested in, it has a pretty large impact in the areas that we teach. She is an expert in that area, and she has some really, really insightful conversations on her podcast related to race and equity.
Excellent. So thank you. And really great summaries. I could not have written it better. So Rebecca, I introduced you to T for Teaching because when I was first trying to figure out this podcast, I was like, it was one of those things where it's like, I know I have the germ of a good idea, but I don't know exactly what I want to do with it. I know do preliminary research, adult ed, as you mentioned, there really isn't adult ed in our sphere. There is ESL, and that's I've seen, of course, I'm talking anecdotally, of course, because I was doing my own research, and this was now 2 years ago. So it could be very outdated, but I found ESL resources, but they were primarily for K-12 podcasts. I found a podcast called the Adult Education Podcast, but it was really focused more on lifelong learning, and in the sense of learning for the sake of growing internally or as your own individual. So while I haven't listened to it, and I still think that there's definitely space for that, it wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for specifically people that work in literacy, high school equivalency, and adult ESL in different settings. And it was really falling short. So I found T for Teaching, which was the closest at the time because it is in the community and university college settings. But again, not quite what I'm talking, what I wanted to focus on, but I did listen to it just to get an idea of formatting and topics. And now I'm talking about my own internal process. I'm not saying that everyone with a podcast does this, but I listen to so much stuff just trying to get ideas for different reasons. And that was one of it. So I introduced you to T for Teaching because I thought it was interesting. And there was like, whoa, this is close. And then you introduced me to Bright Morning, which I didn't know about previously. We were reading a professional development book that Elena Aguilar, the host of that podcast, wrote with someone else. And that was great. I thought that book was fun. Again, that was a K-12 focus, but I thought it was really applicable to adults, specifically because it was about professional development for teachers. And, teachers are generally adults. So usually adults. So that was that was really interesting for me. I was familiar with Cult of Pedagogy, the website. I used the website ideas a lot. She has a blog. It's basically like her business, right? Where she talks about teaching techniques and like her own experiences. And I loved her writing. I thought it was great. I got some good teaching ideas from that. And then you were telling me, oh, she's also doing a podcast. So I was listening to that. And that was so, in that sense too, very just inspiring and enlightening. So we kind of did we did a share there, right? We were kind of geeking out in different ways.
Yep.
So one of the things that, I wanted us to do was we talk about these 3 podcasts just to give you a general overview for the audience. And then we want to get into just a couple of episodes or where to start, because unlike generally most books, right? Podcasts, you don't need to listen to the first episode unless it's specifically linear or chronological. And these are conversations, so they're topic based. So we were thinking about which episodes would be a good starting point if this is a route you want to take, is learning more about education from podcasts. So Rebecca, why don't you start with the podcast you want to talk about and some episodes that you found particularly impactful or a great place to start?
So just like you said, Nadia, you do not need to start at the beginning. And in some cases, the first episode of a podcast is not its best one. So you might want to start on 2.
that is also fair. It's kind of like a television show. Like, you're finding your footing. You have your idea, right? You know what you want to talk about, but you're still kind of like baby stepping it a little bit, unless you're like a master podcaster, which isn't always the case.
Okay, so with Cult of Pedagogy, let's start there. And so again, she was a former K-12 teacher turned podcaster, and she really does a great job of focusing on some of the big ideas in education. And so there were 3 episodes that we identified that were super great starting points. And so those episodes are 206, which is the Thinking Classroom, and that is a special for our HSE math instructors. And so that one talks a lot about some strategies for teaching math. It's a stand-up classroom and very engaging strategies for working with your students. The people who designed that strategy have a full online community to support instructors. And so it applies, I think, even beyond just math instructors. The second one with Cult of Pedagogy that is very good is episode 209, and that is about trauma-informed practices in the classroom. And that one features an interview with a person who wrote a book, and she's a former or possibly current instructor in an alternative school that works with students who have high behavioral health needs. And so I thought that given that we do work with a lot of students who have trauma experiences in their past, there were strategies that could be gained out of that episode that might be interesting to you to import to your classroom. And since you're talking with someone who's a high school teacher, it's not too far off from what we do. And so I thought that she also gives a really good summary of some of the things in her book in that episode, the person who's the guest.
Before you go on, I just wanted to highlight like the Thinking Classroom one. I really jumped in on that. It was so exciting to just hear about the strategies. So to flex, our nerdy academic brain is like, it really does like emphasize a constructivist model where students are figuring out math in really small groups, and it's very specific too. They talk about just what tools they use. They also talk about why they use certain tools, which I thought was really interesting. Like for example, every small group had their own whiteboard, not flip chart paper, which is what I'm used to as an adult educator. It was always the flip chart. That's what I had when I was a tutor also. Like, the program didn't give me a board. I was in a room with a bunch of other groups and other tutors, and we had our own little sections, and we just all gave flip chart. But there was just very specific reasoning and the science behind it, what the research has said, why they use these tools. And it's something so simple as a whiteboard versus flip chart paper. a marker versus a permanent marker. Like it was like stuff like that. It was just, I was like, wow, okay, they really break it down. It's like, no, this is a very kind of strict, in a sense, methodology. And I was like, wow, I was floored. And I wish I could have seen a classroom designed like that, especially math. You know, I was a HSC teacher for a couple of years. I taught math, and I didn't really have any models. I was a part-time teacher. I only worked Saturdays at the time. So, you know, no one was around except like one supervisor who I later found out, technically because of how the grant was structured, she wasn't my supervisor, but she was there. I thought she was. Which is like, that's, you know, the weird world of grants, right? But I learned math just by doing. Like, I remembered stuff when I was a student. I went the traditional route of graduating high school and then went to college. So I just grabbed any resources I could online and just going off my memory and strengthening what I had. And I'll be honest, I used a lot of like video to math was the big thing online, and it still is. You can find any video of a math teacher just explaining how you solve this problem. So I would, you know, go that kind of traditional route, and then you see, and then you hear what they're talking about in these thinking classrooms, and you're like, whoa, this is nothing like what I did. Not to, you know, say I was teaching math wrong or something, but this is like a radical way to teach, or because it's constructivist, facilitate a classroom in a way that we might not be used to. So my inner part, like little tiny speck of my brain that still is kind of a math teacher, that was really exciting.
I thought that episode was great. And I think you raised such a good point in that one of the things that these podcasts can do for us is that they filter the massive information that's on the internet. So the people who are leading these podcasts, who are the podcasters themselves, they have done some research into who their guests are. And so they're bringing you guests who have some qualified perspective, because I know I've done the video search too. And some of it's great, some of it is less than great. Okay. And so that's one of the things that we can take away from borrowing ideas off of the podcast, is that they are research-based ideas. They are research-based practices.
Oh, totally. It's like they're curating it for you. You don't have to vet them yourself. You have to vet the host, maybe, but not like, oh, this host is good, right? Yeah. So sorry, I just want to add that like real quick. Is just like what that did for me as a former teacher, which I hope, in a sense, if you know current teachers are listening to this, they have that same drive and spark, that joy that kind of came back that I haven't felt in that very specific sense in a while.
Yeah, I am glad that was your experience with it, because when I heard it, and I do not teach math, I was like, A, the math teachers are going to love this, and B, can it be done for language? Those are my two takeaways.
Which I think it can be. I think it's definitely adaptable. And from what the podcast episode was saying is like, yeah, there are people that create thinking classrooms that don't teach math or don't primarily teach math. So it's very present. Okay, so so we just talked about the thinking classroom. You mentioned the trauma-informed classroom as another episode. Yeah. So can you tell me about the third episode you want to talk about?
Yes. So the third episode that I wanted to mention from Cult of Pedagogy is episode 212. And episode 212 deals with reading instruction. The reason that this one I feel is important for us is, as many of you know, our governor has introduced a literacy initiative for New Mexico. That literacy initiative does focus heavily on how reading is taught in the public schools to elementary age kids. Obviously, because we deal with reading instruction for adults and for adult learners at all levels, it's very likely that there is going to be some impact on how we teach reading instruction to our students as well. What I found in this, and I tell you this as a teacher who was trained in the other method of teaching reading for elementary, actually, is that they do an incredible job of outlining and explaining what science of reading means and why there is controversy in reading instruction how that controversy affects children or anyone who is learning to read, and talks about what would constitute some ideal practices in the reading classroom. So if you have questions about, I mean, it's known popularly in the literature as like the reading wars. If you have any questions about that, this was an amazing episode. And I thought it was really well done in that it was not heavily politicized or blaming one side or another. It really talked about how we got to the point that we're at and what we can do about it. So I recommend that to you if you have questions about reading instruction.
Oh, yeah. I found that helpful in addition because I was really confused at first. I don't have any experience with literacy from K to 12 or adult literacy. So that kind of really clarified what was going on, especially with the kind of fervor that came out in the last few months at the time of this recording. Was like, we've been teaching reading wrong this whole time. And it's like, what is happening? So I think they really do break down that really well, and it helped me just better get a general understanding of what's going on with my literacy colleagues at the very least, or like what's going on in the field and how this may affect our literacy colleagues. My mistake. Really great episodes too. Thank you for sharing.
So should we move on and start talking about T for teaching?
T for teaching, yes.
I want to kind of talk a little bit on the intro about this one. So this is, as Nadia pointed out, this is one that she introduced me to. And I do want to mention that it is actually based out of SUNY Oswego. And so it's college teaching, maybe not specifically community college teaching, but they do address a lot of things related to first-year students and things that apply to our learners. So Nadia, I think you had a couple episodes you wanted to feature on this podcast.
Yes. So T for teaching, one of the episodes that I listened to recently that kind of resonated with me was episode number 307. Career readiness. So the reason why I felt that one was really interesting was because it was an emphasis on college teachers and how to contextualize career skills within their classroom. So I was an adjunct on the academic side. So it wasn't necessarily adult ed side. And I'm only talking about my experience, I'm not talking about anyone else's. But the department that I worked under did not prepare me for teaching. It kind of like, okay, here, why do you want this job? I'm finishing up my master's. I'm like, this is blah, blah, blah. This is what I want. And then they gave me a schedule. And I was like, okay. So I had at that time, that was before I got into adult ed. So I had no experience. And I haven't taken education classes. So I was kind of thrown to the wolves. And I kind of tried to emulate what I knew, which was the college teaching as sort of lecture-based, presentation-based. And it always bothered me, and it still kind of bothers me a bit personally, in a sense that I know that my students, especially where I was working at the time, a lot of them were working class students, and they were fed this idea that college education automatically means you get a good job. Which was unfortunate because that's not really the case anymore. Now it's more like this will probably get you a job over someone who doesn't have a college degree. Like that's kind of our reality. But anyway, it always bothered me that I did this lecture point. I didn't at the time, and now I know, as a more seasoned instructor who had that opportunity to learn more about adult learning and contextualizing, and also career skills, because that's what my students really needed more than anything. And I think all of our students we all have very different students with different goals. But one thing that does come up is skills. And what are these skills? For this episode particularly, they discussed career readiness skills. They used a competency system, and they really just talked about what are these skills, how did they find them, and how are they able to implement into their classrooms, and also like all the work that had to be done to do that, because it's not as simple as just changing a few words around in your lecture or your your learning plan, like you really have to rethink your delivery. You have to rethink your objectives. And I think that just gave me, and also like I mentioned, all of the partner kind of along with it. So like the institution, what other teachers done, how you guys work together. And that helped me a lot. And I was just like, wow, there's just so much work. You know, at first it's a little daunting, like, oh my goodness, all the work that needs to be done to change systems, right? But in the long run, we have to really think about our students and what's best for them. And one of the best things is listening to them, talk to them. What are they looking for? What do they want? What do they need? What's a transferable skill to them? And I just think like some of the ideas just kind of like bounced around my head, and I really like to just talk about that with other people. And we kind of, Rebecca and I are in a unique positions that we can do that. As professional learning coordinators, we have these opportunities with each other, but also with the field, just having these conversations about these skills. And it's really exciting.
This interview will continue on the next part of this episode. Thank you for listening to the Nadia podcast.